Hello, dear history lovers. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we are going to dive deep into the Middle Ages. In this long and detailed video, we will take a comprehensive look at the Middle Ages from the beginning to the end. If you're ready, let's start our time travel. The beginning of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are generally considered to have begun with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. This date is seen as the end of antiquity and the beginning of a new era. However, there's no consensus among historians. Some argue that the transition was slower and gradual. The fall of the Roman Empire created a huge power vacuum in Europe. This vacuum was filled by various Germanic tribes. The Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Franks, Vandals, and many other tribes established their own kingdoms in the former Roman lands. This was also a period of great migrations. This process, known as the migration of tribes, which started with the pressure of the Hun Empire, deeply affected the ethnic and cultural structure of Europe. Early Middle Ages, 5th to 10th centuries. The early Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages. During this period, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, central authority in Europe weakened. The economy declined and cultural activities declined. During this period, the system of feudalism began to spread in Europe. Feudalism was a system that regulated the relationship between landowners, lords, and the peasants, serfs, who worked the land. This system shaped the social and economic structure of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, Christianity spread rapidly in Europe, and the church gained great influence over society. Monasteries became not only religious centers, but also centers of education and culture. During this period, Islam also began to spread rapidly. Originating in 7th century Arabia, Islam soon spread to the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. This spread marked the beginning of a long struggle between Europe and the Islamic world. One of the most important events of the early Middle Ages was the Viking raids. From the late 8th century onwards, Vikings from Scandinavia raided the coastal regions of Europe and established permanent settlements in some areas. High Middle Ages, 11th and 13th centuries. The High Middle Ages are considered a period of revitalization in Europe. During this period, the population increased, cities grew, trade revived, and cultural activities accelerated. One of the most important events of this period was the Crusades. Started in 1095 with the call of Pope Urban II, the Crusades were organized to take back Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims. These campaigns lasted for nearly 200 years and profoundly affected relations between Europe and the Islamic world. In the High Middle Ages, the institution of chivalry also gained importance. In addition to being a warrior class, knights adopted a lifestyle that represented values such as honor, loyalty, and courage. During this period, great cathedrals began to be built in Europe. The Gothic architectural style emerged and magnificent buildings such as Notre Dame and Chartres rose. There were also important developments in the field of education. The first universities were founded in this period. Universities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford played an important role in the intellectual life of Europe. Late Middle Ages, 14th, 15th centuries. The Late Middle Ages are seen in many ways as a period of crisis. During this period, Europe faced major disasters. The most important of these was the Black Plague, which wiped out a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. This epidemic changed the demographic structure of Europe and deeply affected economic and social life. The Hundred Years' War, which began in the 18th century, was a long period of conflict between England and France. These wars depleted the resources of both countries and weakened the feudal system. The rise of the Ottoman Empire was also an important development in the late Middle Ages. The Ottomans conquered Constantinople, Istanbul, in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire. This event is generally recognized as the end of the Middle Ages. Society and culture in the Middle Ages. Medieval society was broadly divided into three classes: those who prayed, clergy; those who fought, nobles and knights; and those who worked, peasants and artisans. The transition between these classes was very difficult. The church had a great influence on society throughout the Middle Ages. Religion shaped people's daily life and influenced art and literature. Monasteries became centers where knowledge was preserved and passed on. Art in the Middle Ages was often shaped around religious themes. Painting, sculpture, and architecture often dealt with religious subjects. Romanesque and Gothic architectural styles emerged during this period. In literature, knightly novels and folk tales were popular. Works such as Dante's Divine Comedy and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales were written during this period. Science and technology in the Middle Ages. Although the Middle Ages are characterized as dark, important scientific and technological developments took place during this period. The Islamic world made significant progress in science and philosophy, especially between the 8th and 12th centuries. Scientists such as Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Biruni made important studies in fields such as mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Scientific studies in Europe also gained momentum, especially from the 12th century onwards. Thinkers such as Roger Bacon and William of Ockham laid the foundations of the modern scientific method. There were also important developments in the technological field. Water and windmills became widespread, and agricultural productivity increased. Inventions such as the compass, gunpowder, paper, and the printing press reached Europe and led to great changes. Economy in the Middle Ages. The economy of the Middle Ages was initially based on agriculture and had a closed structure. However, over time, trade revived and cities gained importance. The feudal system was the basis of the economy. Land was the most important means of production, and the relationship between lords and serfs determined the economic structure. Starting from the 1st century, trade began to revive. Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa became prominent in Mediterranean trade. Trade unions such as the Hanseatic League were established in Northern Europe. The banking system also began to develop during this period. Italian bankers began to operate throughout Europe. Political structure in the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, central authorities were weak in Europe. Feudal principalities and small kingdoms were dominant. However, over time, strong monarchies began to emerge. Powerful kingdoms such as the Capet dynasty in France and the Norman dynasty in England were established. The Holy Roman Germanic Empire was an important power in Central Europe throughout the Middle Ages. However, this empire could never achieve complete unity. The papacy stood out as a political power. There were struggles for authority between the Pope and the kings. One of the most important of these struggles was the investment struggle in the 11th century. Wars and conflicts in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were a period of constant wars and conflicts. The most important of these wars were the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and the Reconquista, taking back Spain from the Muslims. The Crusades were a series of wars between European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims between the 11th and 13th centuries. These campaigns had not only military, but also cultural and economic consequences. The 100 Years' War was a protracted conflict between England and France between the 14th and 15th centuries. These wars had a profound impact on the political and social structure of both countries. The Reconquista was the struggle of the Christian kingdoms in Spain to reclaim lands under Muslim rule. This process began in the 8th century and ended with the fall of Granada in 1492, the end of the Middle Ages and the transition to the Renaissance. There is no consensus among historians about the end of the Middle Ages. However, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 or the discovery of America in 1492 are generally accepted as the end of the Middle Ages. Towards the end of the century, the Renaissance rebirth movement began in Europe. This movement is characterized by a renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture. The invention and widespread use of the printing press allowed information to spread more quickly and widely. This played an important role in the spread of the Renaissance and the subsequent Reformation movement. The geographical discoveries also began during this period. The discovery of America and the opening of sea trade routes increased Europe's influence over the world and paved the way for the beginning of the modern era. Legacy of the Middle Ages. Although the Middle Ages are often characterized as a dark period, they left an important legacy to the modern world. Many modern institutions, such as universities, parliaments, and the banking system, find their origins in the Middle Ages. The philosophical and theological debates of the Middle Ages laid the foundations of modern thought. The ideas of thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham influenced Renaissance and Enlightenment thought. The artistic and architectural works of the Middle Ages, Gothic cathedrals, manuscripts, frescoes, are still admired today. The ideals of chivalry and the concept of romantic love that developed in the Middle Ages continue to influence modern culture. The role of women in the Middle Ages. The social role of women in the Middle Ages was generally limited. However, there were women who came to the fore and left their mark on history during this period. Noblewomen sometimes assumed important political roles. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine became queen of both France and England and exerted great political influence. Nuns living in convents were involved in education and writing. Some nuns, such as Hildegard of Bingen, were among the most important thinkers of the period. Middle-class women took part in various crafts and trade activities, especially in the cities. Daily life in the Middle Ages. Daily life in the Middle Ages was very different from today. Most people lived in rural areas and engaged in agriculture. The diet was usually based on cereals. Meat was a luxury for most people. Spices were a status symbol for the rich. Hygiene conditions were very poor. This led to the spread of epidemics. Entertainment activities included religious festivals, fairs, and tournaments. Music and storytelling were popular forms of entertainment. Religion and belief in the Middle Ages. Religion played a central role in the lives of medieval people. Christianity dominated most of Europe. The church was not only a religious, but also a political and economic power. Popes sometimes engaged in power struggles with kings. Monasteries were the center of religious life. They also functioned as centers of education and culture. From the 7th century onwards, Islam spread rapidly and dominated the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Jews were often oppressed in medieval Europe and occasionally faced pogroms, organized acts of violence. Education in the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, education was usually provided in monasteries and cathedrals. Very few people could read and write. Latin was used as the language of education. Classical texts and religious writings formed the basis of education. Universities started to be established from the 1st century onwards. Universities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford played an important role in the intellectual life of Europe. Scholastic philosophy formed the basis of the medieval education system. This approach tried to explain religious doctrines using logic and argumentation. Medicine and health in the Middle Ages. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was based on ancient Greek and Roman sources. The theories of Galen and Hippocrates formed the basis of medical practice. Diseases were often attributed to an imbalance of the 4 fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Monasteries became centers where medical knowledge was preserved and practiced. Many monasteries had hospitals, infirmary. The Islamic world made significant advances in the field of medicine. Ibn Sina's Qanun was used as the main source of medical education for centuries. Epidemics, especially the Black Plague, deeply affected medieval society. Art and architecture in the Middle Ages. Medieval art was often centered around religious themes. Icons, manuscripts, sculptures, and frescoes reflected religious stories and symbols. The Romanesque style of architecture was common in the 11th and 12th centuries. Thick walls, round arches, and small windows were characteristic of this style. The Gothic architectural style appeared in the mid-12th century and was influential until the end of the Middle Ages. Pointed arches, Cross vaults and large stained glass windows were characteristic features of Gothic architecture. Manuscripts were an important part of medieval art. Produced in monasteries, they often contained religious texts and were decorated with magnificent miniatures. Music in the Middle Ages. Music in the Middle Ages consisted largely of religious music. Gregorian chant was the most important musical form of this period. There was also secular music. Troubadours and trouvères sang songs on themes of love and chivalry. Polyphonic music began to develop towards the end of the Middle Ages. This meant playing different melodies at the same time. Music notation also developed during this period. Guido d'Arezzo laid the foundations of the modern notation system. Philosophy in the Middle Ages. Medieval philosophy was often an attempt to reconcile religious beliefs with philosophical thought. In the early Middle Ages, thinkers such as Augustine tried to combine Christian faith with Platonic philosophy. Scholastic philosophy was the dominant philosophical movement of the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas was the most important representative of this movement and combined Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. The Islamic world also produced important philosophers. Thinkers such as Ibn Sina and Averroes synthesized Greek philosophy with Islamic thought and influenced Western philosophy. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, thinkers such as William of Ockham began to criticize scholastic philosophy and advocate a more empirical approach. Law in the Middle Ages. The legal system in the Middle Ages was a mixture of Roman law, Germanic traditions, and canon law. The feudal system had created its own legal structure. Lords had jurisdiction over their own lands. Church courts had jurisdiction over religious matters and some civil matters, such as marriage. Magna Carta, 1215, was one of the most important legal documents of the Middle Ages. It limited the powers of the king and guaranteed some basic rights. Transportation and communication in the Middle Ages. Transportation was very difficult in the Middle Ages. Roads were often poorly maintained and travel was dangerous. Sea travel was faster and more economical than land travel. Maritime city-states such as Venice and Genoa took advantage of this situation. Communication was often slow. News spread through merchants, travelers, or private messengers. There was a network of communication between monasteries, and this network played an important role in the dissemination of information and news. Agriculture and technology in the Middle Ages. Agriculture was the basis of the economy in the Middle Ages. The vast majority of the population lived in rural areas and engaged in agriculture. The three-field system was a widely used agricultural method in the Middle Ages. This system increased the fertility of the soil. Watermills and windmills were important technological developments of the Middle Ages. These machines increased agricultural production and were the forerunners of the Industrial Revolution. Innovations such as horse harnessing and the use of horseshoes increased agricultural productivity. Cities in the Middle Ages. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, cities were small and few in number. But from the 11th century onwards, cities began to grow and gain importance. Cities were often surrounded by walls and had narrow, winding streets. Guilds played an important role in the city economy. These organizations represented artisans and merchants. People who lived in cities often had more freedom. The saying, "The city air makes one free," reflected this. Military technology in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages saw significant advances in military technology. Knights' armor became more complex and effective. Castle architecture developed. Stone castles were the center of defense systems. Weapons such as longbows and crossbows became effective on battlefields. The arrival of gunpowder in Europe had a profound impact on military technology and led to the development of firearms. The end of the Middle Ages and the transition to the modern age. The end of the Middle Ages is characterized by a series of important events and developments. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, and many Byzantine scholars fled to the West. This contributed to the acceleration of the Renaissance. The invention and spread of the printing press enabled knowledge to spread faster and more widely. Geographical discoveries increased Europe's influence over the world and led to the opening of new trade routes. The Reformation shook the authority of the Catholic Church and led to the emergence of new Protestant denominations. The scientific revolution laid the foundations of modern science. Scientists such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton radically changed our understanding of the universe. These developments marked the end of the Middle Ages and set the stage for the beginning of the modern era. But this transition was not a sudden and sharp change, but a long process. Conclusion. What comes to mind when you think of the Middle Ages? Knights, castles, witch hunts? Well, you would not be wrong, but the truth is much more interesting. Feudal system. Imagine, the king sits on his throne, the lords rule the land, and the peasants work in the fields. Everyone has a duty, but freedom, that's a bit problematic. Time for chivalry. You like Game of Thrones, right? Here in the Middle Ages, every day was like a goatee episode. Knights fighting for honor, competing in tournaments, rescuing beautiful princesses. Sure, there were no dragons, but dragon legends abounded. The plague, the most terrible event of the Middle Ages. Have you heard of the Black Death? The plague wiped out a third of Europe's population. Imagine 1 out of every 3 people. This makes today's pandemics look like child's play. Monasteries, the hidden heroes of the Middle Ages. Monks didn't just pray, my friends. They were real nerds who preserved knowledge and copied books. We even owe it to them to brew beer. Crusades, the greatest road trip of the Middle Ages. These expeditions to the East introduced Europeans to new cultures, new food, and new ideas. But of course, the journey was not a peaceful one. We have tried to summarize the 1,000-year journey of the Middle Ages for you. Although this period is often described as dark, it was actually a time of great change, important discoveries, and profound thinking. The Middle Ages was a time when the foundations of the modern world were laid. Many of the institutions and concepts we use today find their origins in this period. Universities, the banking system, modern languages, even the concept of romantic love are all legacies of the Middle Ages. Here's a brief overview of the Middle Ages. Would you like to learn more about this period? Then write "More Middle Ages" in the comments. And remember, history is not just about old events. It is the key to understanding our present. See you in the next video. Take care, and don't forget to read history.